Welcome to Resolutions, the official podcast of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. Every episode is a journey into the heart of conflict resolution, guided by our diverse community of experts. We're here to explore innovative strategies, share wisdom from the field, and inspire excellence in resolving disputes. Whether you're a dispute resolution professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about fostering understanding and peace, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's conversation and discover how we can transform conflict into opportunity together.
I'm your host, Darren Gothelf. This week I'm sitting with diplomat and author Dennis Ross to discuss his incredible career and how it overlaps with the ADR profession. Dennis Ross is an American diplomat and author with a distinguished career spanning over 4 decades in U.S. foreign policy and Middle East affairs. He has served under multiple presidential administrations, including the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations, where he was a key advisor and negotiator on Arab-Israeli peace efforts, Iran policy, and regional security issues. Widely recognized for his expertise in diplomacy and conflict resolution, Dennis has written extensively on international relations and currently serves as a counselor and fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome, Dennis.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
All right, I should mention Dennis recorded the keynote speech for the upcoming virtual 2025 ABA Advanced Mediation Advocacy Skills Institute, which is going to be October 22nd and 23rd. For those of you that haven't registered yet, this is your opportunity to learn from leading authorities, interact with colleagues from across the country, and explore mediation advancements and innovation. Mediators, litigators, educators, in-house counsel, and other consumers of ADR services alike should attend this fantastic event. I'm sorry I had to do the shameless plug right there, but it's going to be a fantastic institute. And as I was briefly sharing with Dennis, I did catch a sneak peek at the recording that he did with Doug for the keynote speech, and it was fantastic. So as we jump into the discussion, could you briefly describe your role at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the work that they do?
The Washington Institute for Near East Policy is what might be called a think and do tank. What I mean by that is it's designed to conceptualize and understand the challenges that face the U.S. and the Middle East on the one hand, and on the other hand, lay out policy prescriptions, what I like to say, what needs to be done and then how to do it. It covers the whole range of issues, not just geographically, but also functionally throughout the region as a whole, and also how the region interacts with other regions, how it affects American interests. It's a unique think tank in that it's the only one in Washington that takes no money from any foreign sources.
Now, I don't oftentimes get the opportunity to interview diplomats that mediate topics as interesting and complex as Middle East peace. But to bring it back to mediation, one of the most important parts of the mediation process is understanding the perspective of the other side. Whether you're mediating a dispute between 2 countries or 2 family members, how do you get the parties to walk in each other's shoes?
It's one of the hardest tasks as a mediator because you have to somehow educate each. And I use the word educate, I put it in quotes because it can't look like you're trying to, quote, educate them. They'll resist that. But you have to be able to say to each side, I understand what your needs are. We can't get your needs addressed unless we address the other side's needs. I used to go through and I would spend enormous amounts of time showing I understood what each side needed, because I understood I couldn't begin to raise the other side's needs until I could prove to one side that I really understood what they needed. And even after I'd go through that, I would say, all right, let me summarize what I understand to be what you have to have. And even when they'd say, yes, that's it, you got it. Now that we've established that, if we're going to achieve that, we have to be able to address the other side's needs. And the minute I would switch to the other side, they'd say, yeah, but what about my needs? Because there's such a fear that somehow, it's not just that their needs won't be addressed, it's that somehow they will be eroded over time. That whatever they say are their needs, they'll be whittled down. One of the things I always found in negotiations and mediations that was one of the hardest tasks to really come to grips with what bottom lines were, because each side will always protect their bottom line. What fear is they're going to be pushed to those prematurely and they'll have to go beyond them. So they build what I used to call moats to create these kind of separation from what they're really trying to protect. When you're going over needs, you really have to have a kind of discussion that allows you to learn what really is important to them. So a lot of getting to that point is asking lots of questions, showing a level of interest, which is also a way of showing respect at the same time. But the key here is having each side understand, okay, your needs won't be addressed unless the other side's needs are addressed. This isn't a case of self-sacrifice. This is a case of achieving what is important to you and how to do it.
Fantastic. Among the chief principles of a properly functioning democracy is the freedom to debate issues through civil discourse. As someone who's worked with both Democrat and Republican administrations, has partisan politics gotten worse over the years, and how can we bring the sides together? And I think you're particularly good at answering this question because there are so few people that have your background working with both sides of the political aisle.
I will say it used to be easier to do that
Yeah.
because the gaps between the two sides were more bridgeable, number one. Number two, the politics weren't defined in such polarized terms. Number three, there wasn't this sense of huge stakes. Well, that if you lost, it's like the world ended. And we're at a point now where each side tends to look at the other as the enemy. There's a presumption that you don't have anything in common. Republicans and Democrats don't share anything. This is a reality where everything is measured in zero-sum terms. My win is your loss. There's never this sense that we both have something to gain and we both have something to lose. I used to go, when I was the negotiator for Bill Clinton, I used to spend a lot of time on the Hill. I would come back and brief on where the negotiations were. I would typically have a very significant group of centrists, Democrats and Republicans. They represented the majority of people on the Hill. Today, they're a minority. It's the extremes that are the majorities now, and those extremes, almost by definition, look through a lens of great enmity. So the answer to your question is, number one, yes, it's much harder than it used to be because the level of polarization is much deeper than it used to be.
Yeah, I have this image in my head where I'm imagining maybe in the old days, members of Congress of different parties at the end of the day could still go to the bar together and have a beer and talk about non-politically related items. But these days, just the fear of probably being caught by a reporter or something like that, hanging out with the other side might sink their political careers. So I guess they probably don't even do that.
Well, think about Ronald Reagan was very close to Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was a Democratic Speaker of the House, but they had a great relationship. It wasn't unusual for Republicans and Democrats to really socialize together.
Yeah.
That's just not the case anymore. It isn't to say that there aren't some who would like to be able to do that, but the penalty for doing it is going up because you're seen as somehow betraying your side if you engage in that. So that's half of the question. The other half was, what can you do to try to minimize that? I think the key is to try to identify some issues where there's a greater potential for convergence than divergence. You take, for example, issues like Medicaid and Medicare. There are a lot of Republicans from red states who realize that if you cut that and you're in a state like, I don't know, say Iowa, and you have rural hospitals, or take a state from the South, say a state like Mississippi, if they lose the money to support the rural hospitals, that's a disaster for them. So you try to identify those issues where there's a common interest, because at the local level, there's not such great polarization. A lot of mayors or governors have to be practical. So try to look at the practical issues and see if you can create some kind of bridge.
And what's the saying that all politics is local, right? Now, I got this next one from your interview with Doug, and I thought this was particularly interesting and something that's important when I'm teaching mediation. You said in a negotiation, most sides make the mistake of negotiating for what they want, but not what they need. Can you explain the difference between the two and how confusing them can damage the settlement process?
Everybody goes into a negotiation more focused on what's important to them in a general sense. They have aspirations. There's a difference between aspiration and necessity. So there's a gap there. The trick to a successful negotiation or a successful mediation is to try to figure out what really is fundamentally important as opposed to what's really desirable. Each side is going to have a set of wants, and the wants usually widen the gaps between them. The wants relate also to what the political payoffs are, or how do they reduce their political price? Why is it so difficult to close negotiations or mediations? Because those that you're dealing with always think they can do a little bit better or they can give up a little bit less. And so they want to stretch it out. I don't recall if I told this story, but when I was negotiating with Jim Baker for the first START treaty, which was a strategic arms reduction talks, we were at a point where we had been negotiating for a while and the Soviet team had come to the State Department. Baker was heading and I was on the team. Shevardnadze was the foreign minister. We went in and Margaret Tutwiler, who was the spokesperson for the department, asked me as we were going in, how many issues do you have left? And I said, we have 4. We came out about 5 hours later and she said, how'd you do? I said, we did great. So she said, so what's left? How many issues do you have left? I said, we have 4. She said, what? You didn't achieve anything? I said, no, we solved those 4. We have 4 new ones. Because the closer you get to concluding, new issues will always emerge. The reason is because it's not easy to close. It's one of the reasons there are times when you impose deadlines. So the key, I think, in terms of coming to grips with the gap between needs and wants is spending enough time to understand, okay, now I can see why they have a certain set of aspirations, but those aspirations go too far in terms of what the other side can accept. And so we have to get back to the basics in terms of what do they have to have. And it's a difficult, I always felt there were 2 really hard tasks as a mediator. One was to get each side to recognize their needs wouldn't be addressed unless they address the other side's. And 2 was to get them to scale back their wants to what they had to have. You're adjusting expectations, and adjusting expectations is hard. But it takes time, and you have to be patient, and you have to explain a lot. And you come back to saying, look, I can get you X, but I can't get you Y. You need X. Y would be nice for you, but X you have to have. If you keep pushing for Y, you're neither get Y or X.
Right. Now, based on your career, and I'm going to go with your negotiation style, you seem like somebody who's pretty good at active listening. And you mentioned earlier in our interview today how important that is. How important is active listening to the mediation process? And would you say it's equally important for both facilitative and evaluative style mediators?
I think anybody who negotiates, the one attribute they have to have is being a good listener. When I use the term active listening, I mean engaging the other side, not in a way where you're trying to plumb for information, because when they think you're trying to plumb for what their bottom lines are, they're going to shut down. What you're trying to do instead is you're trying to show, look, I want to understand why such an issue is so important to you. With the Palestinians, I would say, I want to understand why the symbols of independence are so important to you. I mean, I get you want to have a state. I get that you want to be free of the Israelis, but we can get there in stages. And yet every issue you turn into a symbol of independence. And we can't get a lot of these early on. We have to build to it. So you need to explain to me, why is this so important to you? And they would say, look, we have a history of never being able to decide for ourselves. And if we're going to sell this to our public, we have to show, look what we've gotten. Look what we have now, what we've never had before. So that could only come from my constantly asking questions. I mean, it wasn't enough to say, we need to be independent. We need these symbols. You have to probe deeper. You're probing not, again, for bottom lines, you're probing to understand. And by the way, when you do it, I said this before, nothing is more important than showing respect to the people that you're either negotiating with or you're meeting between. Especially in those that I was dealing with, respect was a huge issue. They took it, they were sensitive to anything that indicated a lack of it. So you had to go out of your way. And being someone who listened and who asked questions and was showing interest was extremely important to building a level of trust in you as well.
So I was having this conversation with a couple of mediators actually just last night. We were rehearsing for a presentation, and this is a question I ask mediators and negotiators, especially for mediators that work in the space of, let's say, personal injury, right? I always ask them during your pre-mediation conference calls with each of the parties that you're holding separately, do you ask each side confidentially what their walkaway number is? What is the number that we have to kind of get to resolve this issue? And both of them said no. One of them said something very poignant. He said, the reason I don't ask for that number is I know whatever number they're going to give me isn't the actual number. They're going to change their mind in the process. Leading to that, how does misdirection play a role in the negotiation process? And if you feel a party is misdirecting you or the other side, do you call them out on it or let it be part of the process?
I want to comment on the earlier point about
Yeah,
not asking for a number, because I think it relates to the issue of bottom lines
yeah,
that I was talking about. A lot of times, by the way, there are those who go into negotiations and they haven't thought through their bottom lines, or they think they have a bottom line, but it's actually because they haven't thought through, it actually isn't their bottom line. Number one, bottom lines can change for the better, meaning you can become less demanding if you see the other side is responding in ways to you that changes your image of them. You go into a mediation or even a negotiation and you have a set of expectations about the other side. And if somehow they go out of their way to sort of prove themselves to you, that changes what you think is important to you and what you can live with. The reason you don't press for a number up front is because, as they, as the people you were talking to said, you don't know how real that number is. And by the way, the number could be maybe when they say it to you, they're almost certainly negotiating with you. So you really don't want to get into that kind of a position with them. And I think, the broader question you're asking, remind me again, the broader question you were asking was,
oh, just how misdirection plays a role in
oh,
the
just the role
negotiation
of
process.
misdirection.
And is this something that you would call out one of the parties on doing, or would you just let it be part of the process?
I think there isn't a definitive answer on that.
Yeah.
And the reason is it depends on what the misdirection is. It depends on why they've decided to do this. Maybe they've decided to do it because they feel the other side's being too aggressive. Or maybe they've decided to do it because they think you're pressing too hard for answers at that point. And so they're misdirecting you. Now, if it's misdirection because they're playing a game, then I call them out on it. I have to look at the context to decide, is it misdirection? What's the motivation for the misdirection? If it's just the character of who you're dealing with, then you call them out. If it's because they feel they've been put in a bad position, then you figure out how you can put them in a better position.
Yeah. To your earlier point about timing and the time when it's right to have a mediation or any type of negotiation, one thing that I've seen, and it usually doesn't work out well for the party kind of going in with this philosophy, is not having a number in mind or not even knowing enough about the case of what to ask for. That's when you really have to do a little bit more research, a little bit more discovery on your position. Because if you're just going to use mediation as a protracted form of discovery, that's kind of an expensive way to do discovery, to kind of see what you can quote unquote get, but you're probably not going to settle your case. So I always tell the parties, if now is not the right time to do the mediation, you want to do a little bit more research on your position, do the mediation in the future.
I think that's really good advice.
Yeah.
In mediations, I would never bring the parties together until I felt that I had identified points of convergence that they either didn't appreciate or didn't understand.
Yeah. It's actually a good segue into my next question about bringing the parties together. Mediators often have differing opinions on when or even if to bring the parties together in a joint caucus. As someone who has dealt with tension-filled, high-stakes situations, how do you decide if it makes sense to bring the parties together, and when do you know if it's the right time?
I always govern it based on, I don't want to bring them together until I know I can surprise them with points of convergence that they didn't fully appreciate. Now, why do I want to do it that way? Because I want to impress them that this is more doable than they thought going in. So I gave the example, I think I've given this example many times. When I brought the Israelis and Palestinians together, when I was sent out to mediate on the issue of Hebron, I waited 10 days before I brought them together. I spent every day, I would see each of them in parallel. And I was focused on, I don't want to bring them together until I can show I have a framework for how we can proceed based on a set of common principles that they may not realize they actually can live with. But when I present this to them, they'll suddenly change their mind about whether or not this is doable. The idea you bring them together before you get that point, you'll have a food fight very quickly. And what it will do is it'll convince each side there's nothing we can do here. What you're doing in a mediation is actually showing them, no, there is something you can do here. There are points of convergence, but I would never bring them together until I had enough to be able to show that. My purpose when I actually had 6 principles I identified, and I created a framework out of that. And I said, okay, we now have a framework we can negotiate, and we can see where we start and we can see where we end.
Is the nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to a good negotiation strategy, or does this strategy favor a certain type of dispute? I thought that was kind of an interesting term.
I think one of my mistakes between Israelis and Palestinians was to come up with a formula, nothing's agreed until everything is agreed. On the surface, it sounds great.
Yeah.
Because it makes it easier for each side to negotiate because they don't feel like they're doing something that's irrevocable. That's true, but in the case of Israelis and Palestinians, one of the consequences was that we didn't build these baselines of agreement. If we had built baselines of agreement, we'd be in a very different place than we are today. Instead, we built this whole edifice where we had interim agreements, but when we had chances to build on those, we didn't succeed. And because of the principle, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, the negotiations we had on permanent status issues, we could have achieved a number of advances. We could have achieved advances as it related to the scope of autonomy for Palestinians. We could have achieved advances in terms of the scope of responsibilities Palestinians had on security. We could have achieved some advances on the use of territories, what could be done, what couldn't be done. We could have achieved advances on the issue of water. We actually, on water, we reached an agreement between the specialists on each side. Water as a principle is a really hard thing to deal with because you have aquifers in the West Bank that feed directly into the aquifers that the Israelis have. So if those get spoiled, you spoil the Israeli aquifers as well. So the idea that when the Palestinians came in, they said, we have to control our own water. For the Israelis, that was a non-starter because it meant that they could affect Israel's water. So instead, we came up with a concept, let's talk about water allocations. And we reached an agreement on water allocations, but because nothing was agreed until everything was agreed, that disappeared. Had I focused on what's agreed will be agreed, we would have been able to resolve water as an issue. And it would have made much more sense to do it that way. Unfortunately, I didn't realize it until it was too late.
You know, one of the interesting things about your background is certainly in the majority I find of practicing mediators and arbitrators and folks in the ADR space have some legal background. Maybe they just went to law school, maybe they were a practicing attorney, maybe they were a judge for a while. But most of us, myself included, that went to law school, even if we were, let's say, a history major prior to going to law school, we didn't come from an academic background. We're not used to doing a ton of research. So with your background kind of coming from an academic background and writing papers on the Middle East and studying the Middle East, you've mentioned one of the most important keys to success in mediation is knowing everything you can about the parties before the negotiation process started. Is it more important to know everything about the parties or the dispute itself?
It's a combination. I can't draw a distinction because there are reasons the parties have adopted the positions they have on the nature of the conflict or the dispute. So you can understand what are all the issues in the dispute, but that doesn't tell you why those are issues. It doesn't tell you why something becomes really important to one side and why something else is really important to the other side. So when I say learn everything there is to learn, I mean learn everything about the issues that are in conflict, but learn everything about what are the motivations on each side, what are the fears on each side, what are the perceived costs on each side, what are the explanations each side would need to be able to reach an agreement. I often say diplomacy, even though I have my book, Statecraft 2.0, which is out this year, is a long book. There's a lot about diplomacy is reduced to two simple points. One, take away excuses. There are always excuses for why you can't make a decision, and give explanations for why this decision is made. Whoever you're dealing with will always have a domestic audience it has to address. It'll always have to be able to explain, why was this good for us? Why was this in our interest? So explanation is part of this, this sort of spectrum. The other is basically excuses. There always are excuses for why someone can't do something. You have to take them away and then give them an explanation.
Anger can be one of the most damaging emotions to the negotiation process. Can you talk about how anger, when taken out of context, can actually be useful in moving the negotiation process along?
Anger as a tool can be useful, but you have to get to the point where it's both authentic and credible at the same time. Meaning, being angry from the beginning, suddenly that just becomes the atmosphere. No one will be impressed by someone who's angry all the time. They won't draw a distinction between, why is this different than what we've seen before? But if for someone who basically is always a problem solver and is always trying to reduce the level of anger in the room, to suddenly blow up, that's noteworthy. And it means you push the mediator too far. It means that, you may be losing your relationship with the mediator. The mediator may decide, I'm not interested in helping them out. One thing a mediator does with each side is basically say, I'm here to help you get what you need. But if you sort of so anger the mediator, you say, why should I be helping you? So anger can be very useful, but it should be played, I think, quite selectively. I would rarely blow up, but when I would, it would always be by design, even if I would get more angry than I had anticipated, than I had planned to be. I would reach a point usually of exhaustion where it was quite credible why I was angry, but once I got going, it was hard to control. So I would sometimes go well beyond where I intended to go. And usually it was a function of genuine exhaustion, but also a lot of frustration as well.
Well, you seem like a well-tempered person yourself there. So sometimes and I'd like to think of myself the same way. So sometimes when people that tend to not get angry at a lot of things, all of a sudden get angry at something, people will pay attention because they're like, this person never gets angry. We must have really done something wrong.
No, anger is a tool,
Yeah.
but it has to be seen as being genuine and authentic, and the context also helps to explain it. If it's just out of the blue, it won't have the impact.
Right.
I tell the story of Warren Christopher, who was someone who never blew up. He was mild-mannered, he was very low-key, he never kind of erupted. And yet, when he was upset or angry with something, he would display it by, closing his notebook, getting his briefcase out, putting it in there, starting to button his coat. And that would be a sign, okay, I've had it. I'm done with you. And because it was so out of character, he didn't have to blow up. I would not blow up normally, but when I did, I would actually blow up.
Yeah.
I would really blow. I would erupt. You had to create the circumstance where I was kind of driven to it. And I would think about, all right, we're at a point now where I'm dealing with those who have to understand I hit my limit and they push me over the edge and they're about to lose me. When a mediator has established a relationship with both sides and you use anger to signal you're about to lose me, that's when you're most likely to have an effect.
Now, another area of mediation that I feel that especially more facilitative mediators are kind of afraid to use are deadlines, right? And how important in the mediation process are deadlines? And Considering that some mediators are afraid to use them, do you have any advice for folks that aren't using deadlines in mediations?
Deadlines are like anger. You have to use them at the right moment. I would use them as necessary, precisely because, as I said earlier, it's hard for each side to close, especially in these high stakes negotiations where I've never worked for a political leader who invited the idea that they would make a decision that was going to produce a terrible backlash against them. So they'd come up with all sorts of reasons to delay. I would employ a deadline when there were several factors existing at the same time. One was I knew we were at the point where we weren't going to do better and that playing out the game would risk everything. And in the Middle East setting, I was always worried I'd get a terrorist attack and then that would explode everything and we'd be back to square one. So I did employ a deadline basically in two different negotiations, one on Hebron and then in the Y River. In each case, I employed a deadline. The one on Hebron, I was more dramatic because I announced I was leaving that night. And I announced it, in a way that left me no choice. And I did it deliberately because I knew, and I wasn't a bluff. I said, no, I was leaving. One thing you cannot bluff. You bluff one time, that's it. No one will ever take you seriously again. One thing you never do is you don't bluff. Two things you don't do. You don't bluff and you don't lie. That doesn't mean you can tell the technical truth, technically true, which gives you some space, but you do not lie. I said I was leaving that night. I wouldn't see the Palestinian negotiators because the night before we had worked out what was an agreement. I had gone to then Prime Minister Netanyahu, who happens to still be Prime Minister, and I had told him I could get what he needed, but his negotiators couldn't. I could, and I would do that. And I told Abu Mazen and Saab Erekat that I will deliver, I will produce the Israelis based on what we work out, and you have to produce Arafat. And they agreed. And then at 3 a.m, Saab Erekat called and said, well, the chairman has some questions. And I said, not with me, he doesn't. We had a deal. And even my team was pushing me to at least allow the Palestinians to come in and raise the questions. And I said, no way, for two reasons. I wanted Netanyahu to see that I would hold the line. I suspected there might be something little, but I had to prove I had withheld the line. And two, I knew if I allowed them to come, they would open other issues. And then we would be finished. So I held firm to reinforce what I was saying to them in private, including that I wouldn't see them until they agreed that what we had worked out the previous night, that was it. And that's when I went public also saying I was leaving that night. I wanted them to know, I wasn't kidding. I was under a lot of pressure from the incoming national security advisor said, don't you think maybe you should see him? And I said, no. This was in the last 10 days of Christopher being Secretary of State. He called and said, are you sure you're right on this? I said, yes, I'm sure I'm right on this. I said to both of them, Sandy Berger's national security advisor, about to be, and Warren Christopher, I know where we are in this negotiation. And I know if I allow them to come in and they open everything up, it'll all unravel. And we're not going to let this unravel. You want someone else to do it, you get someone else to do it. I played hardball with everybody because I knew if it unraveled, I didn't think we'd put it back together in. So it was a deadline I was imposing on everybody. But I was convinced I was right, that we had gone as far as we could in terms of settling all the issues. And if we opened anything up, everything that we had would unravel. And it worked. But it was a risk. You have to be prepared. When you do a deadline, you're taking a calculated risk.
I can't think of an example, maybe in more the micro world of mediation that I come from, but one thing that I have seen that's actually been quite effective is, let's say you do a full day mediation and you get to the end of the day and the parties haven't, maybe they're close to a settlement, but you don't have a settlement kind of in place, or maybe you have a framework. The mediator drafts a proposal and goes to the plaintiff and says, listen, I talked to the defendant. They're prepared to accept the mediator proposal I'm about to draft. They're giving you a deadline until 5 o'clock tomorrow or 5 o'clock in 2 days, wherever it might be. You might think never in a million years would they accept the offer, but sometimes they do. They think about it during that period when the offer is valid and they accept it. So, yeah, deadlines can be very powerful in mediation. And again, a lot of the more facilitative mediators kind of shy away from using them. But if settlement is the ultimate goal and you're willing to stick to the deadline, it can have good impact on the result of your case.
I think that also is a function of them trusting the mediator.
Yeah.
The mediator comes in and said, look, I've concluded this is the deal that's there. And if you want it, you can have it. If you don't, okay, then we're not going to have an agreement. But if the mediator is trusted and the mediator's judgment, is part of that, then I think that approach works really well.
Yeah. All right. So deadlines aside, let's say things aren't going well. You've dealt with impasse in your career. What advice do you have on breaking impasse?
Again, it always depends upon what's the source of the impasse. It's not hard to come up with new ideas. I used to always say to people about the Arabs and Israelis, look, if this was just a technical dispute, I'll come up with a technical answer. But this isn't a technical dispute. This is a dispute about identity. This is a subjective psychological dispute. This has historical roots. This gets to each side's self-image of who they are. So when you're in an impasse, what you try to do is you want each side sometimes to take a pause. And then you want to be able to say, look, I want to be able to think through what might be different ideas for how we can resolve this. But I want you also to think, is there anything you can change on your side? Now, if you can, you will help me to help you. I can come up with things, but maybe that's not going to be what you want. So I would ask you to think of what else you could accept, and that will help me to help you.
Yeah.
I think you're constantly putting yourself in a position in what I was doing with, I can't rescue you without your help.
At the end of the day, whether you're negotiating a peace treaty between two countries or mediating a property dispute between two neighbors, are there more similarities than differences in the approach you'd take?
I'm always struck whenever I go speak to the ABA. At the end of my talk, I'll have people come up and say, well, you just do what we do.
Right.
And I say, the fundamental principles aren't any different. The only difference are the stakes. In many cases when I was negotiating, it was life and death. And the people who were involved in it felt it was life and death. I had Israelis and Palestinians in particular, negotiators who had lost members of their family. This was not an abstraction for them. The stakes were highly personal, often very emotional, and there was a deep-seated fear on each side of being accused of being a betrayer. It's hard to grasp that if you haven't been in that kind of a setting or that kind of a context. But the principles I use are not any different. It's just a difference in stakes.
And that's why you're the keynote speaker at the Institute. So we're glad to have you. This has been a fascinating discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, the only thing I would add to this is that, I was sometimes dealing with disputes that didn't have a resolution, not because there wasn't an answer there, but the two sides simply weren't ready for that. Yeah. That their leaders couldn't make those kinds of decisions. And I once said to President Clinton, I said, we are asking them to take on history and mythology in a conflict that is filled with mythology. And no American president ever has to make those kinds of decisions. So yes, that's what helps to produce a difference in stakes. And sometimes you simply have a problem that you can't solve. So then my answer to that is, what can I do to ameliorate it? A lot of mediation from a standpoint of American foreign policy or national security, you mediate for a lot of reasons, not because necessarily you can produce an agreement. First of all, it's showing you're doing your part to try to minimize conflicts. Maybe you can't end them, but maybe you can minimize them or reduce the cost of them. It adds to America's soft power to play that kind of a role. So it is something a little different from the mediation that you might be doing, even if the principles are largely the same. The truth is, stakes are what they are, and you still go through, and as I say from the beginning, you learn everything there is to learn about who you're dealing with on each side.
All right. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for your time, and I hope everybody enjoys the Institute.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on Resolutions. Today's episode has illuminated the powerful impact of effective dispute resolution and showcased the incredible individuals who dedicate themselves to this important work. Our mission is to explore the diverse world of dispute resolution, and we hope we've inspired you to engage with conflict and collaboration in new ways. If you're not yet a member of the ABA section of dispute resolution, we invite you to join our community of professionals making a difference. Your involvement can help us build a more harmonious society together. And if you found value in our conversations, please consider leaving us a review and a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more people and continue our journey towards excellence in dispute resolution. Until next time, keep solving problems, building bridges, and creating positive changes in your communities.